There are 15 wide receivers on the Denver Broncos roster as it stands today. We take a look at our Broncos position preview series leading up to NFL training camp at the end of July. On today's episode, Locked On Broncos, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Director of Video Content at Pro Football Network and Broncos analyst for the Locked On NFL Network. You can follow me on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL. But we're going to break down the Broncos wide receiver depth. How many wide receivers will they carry into the 2021 active roster? There's 15 as it stands right now. It is a loaded room. We break down all the action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You're listening to the Locked On Broncos podcast, hosted by Cody Roark, your daily Broncos podcast.
Starting things off on today's episode of the show, a focus at the wide receiver position in our Broncos position preview continuation here. Next week, we're going to get into a little bit of the offensive line, the tight end position, offensive guard. I think it's important that we really take a look at the skill guys, though, because usually leading up into NFL training camp, you are going to see a strong focus on having a wide variety of guys, because the Broncos, we already know with Courtland Sutton coming back off of his ACL injury to start training camp, the Broncos are not going to push him into anything yet. They're going to ease him in. So he's probably going to be very limited every single day, probably for the first 1 to 2 weeks of NFL training camp. And what limited usually means is that the player takes part in that team-specific position drill, right? I don't think we're going to see too much of Courtland in any of these team periods to start, but obviously as he evolves, he'll continue the route running concept, the position-specific drills with Coach Azzani, working the catches, working the hands, and there's also these other different drills that they do. It's really fun to talk about, but I'll have to show you once I get to Broncos training camp here at the end of July. So Courtland's return is going to be huge for the Broncos this upcoming season, and then also another receiver is returning too, and that's Tim Patrick. He's going to be a big contributor for the Broncos this upcoming season. We saw it last year, and I think that for the Broncos, and for Tim Patrick specifically, he has this chip on his shoulder. He has this motivation. He wants a long-term contract extension. Is it going to be in Denver? I think a lot of that depends on whether or not he wants to stay in Denver. I think that Denver values him based on conversations that I have had, which is why they brought him back. But this is essentially a prove-it year for Tim. And in my opinion, Tim doesn't have to prove anything to me because he balled out last season. He stepped up and became the number one wide receiver with Courtland Sutton out. So when you factor in the size of these two wideouts on the outside at 6'4" and 6'5", I mean, really for any quarterback, hey, I'm going to throw it up, and I know those guys are going to go up and make a play. So that is huge for the Broncos. But in this focus, too, how many wide receivers might the Broncos carry on their active roster? That's going to be a question we answer on towards the end of today's episode of the show, which you can get on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or the Odyssey app. But take a look at some of the departures for the Broncos at wide receiver this offseason. Deshaun Hamilton, obviously on the NFI list, the reserve injured list. He tore his ACL while working out away from the team facility. The team was looking at trading him, and unfortunately, everything kind of fell apart for Deshaun. So he had the ACL. He's no longer a Denver Bronco. So really, I don't look at the Broncos roster necessarily getting any weaker at wide receiver. I think they've actually gotten stronger when you factor in that right now as it stands, they have 15 players, and oh my goodness, that is a lot. But there's some intriguing storylines too that we're going to follow about the wide receiver position. But Jeudy's entering his second season this year for the Broncos. He's had an outstanding minicamp and OTAs for the team. He's been really focused, and a lot of his focus has been on catching the ball, looking it in before trying to make a play, right? And that's a common thing that we see with a lot of wide receivers. They're looking to get their eyes upfield before the ball is in their hands because they're used to just catching it and going. But the reality is different trajectory routes based on the velocity coming off the quarterback's arm. That stuff matters. But for Jerry, really just looking at ball and catching it and then getting upfield because he's going to make guys miss. He's going to create separation as is with his route running ability. So I think that for the Broncos, the expectations are high for Jerry Jeudy in his second season on the roster. And KJ Hamler, I mean, we can't even forget about KJ. KJ, his route running ability is very underrated. I don't think a lot of people talk about it, but when I did my initial film study on him after the Broncos drafted him out of Penn State in round number 2 of the 2020 NFL draft, I mean, he's got those speed outs, those speed cuts that is super, super hard. And not to mention, too, when he runs vertical routes, I mean, he sells it. But he also did this thing against the Pittsburgh Steelers where he gave the DB the look as if he was running a vertical route, and he had such tremendous body control that he throttled down quickly with 2 steps and he hitched up ready for the ball. And then he also did the same thing too, where he sold the vertical route and then he bent it to get to the outside on a deep out route. And that's bread and butter play, because in the NFL, man, with cornerbacks that are playing in a cover 4 look or even a cover 2 look at times, you have an opportunity, if that wide receiver can get behind that DB, and if there's another threat too, and you can identify this in your concept as an offensive coordinator, but if I'm going to go against a team that's running cover 2, I'm going to throw a route out there, whether it be from the tailback, the tight end, an arrow, a flat, or a swing route, and I'm going to hit that deep out route, because against cover 2, the window is really between the safety and the corner, and it's by that sideline there. So we call it a cover 2 fade. You can do that, or you can run it as a cover 2 fade out. And so I think that the Broncos need to attack that even more with KJ Hamler, with his speed. And the question is, can he stay healthy? Can he avoid some of these hamstring injuries that lingered on for him last season? When KJ is healthy and on the field, he has such potential to be a dynamic weapon, end around plays, jet sweeps. And I think that the Broncos would utilize him in some bits and pieces in those types of plays. But I honestly don't think that we're going to see jet sweeps and those end arounds be too much of an emphasis for this team coming up here in 2021. But I think, as we talked about running backs yesterday for the team, being able to run that jet sweep or that fly motion where you're going to fake the handoff to the wide receiver and it's going to cause the defense to spread out wide, and then you come backside with a counter or an inside dive by your running back, Denver's going to be able to run the ball effectively on some of those plays. Obviously, down the distance, hash, that really plays the defensive front that they go against. That's going to play a role. But the wide receivers are so monumental in the running game being developed. I don't think it gets talked about enough. That's why I try to talk about it here on the show, because those wide receivers in Coach Azzani's room, they will not see the field if they do not block. And so we see Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Deshaun Hamilton was a great blocker, Jeudy getting in the blocking, and KJ, a very physical blocker as well, despite his size. So it's very promising there. And Tyrie Cleveland's going to have a chance to carve out a little bit of a role for himself as well. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the Broncos wide receiver room coming up here in just a moment. We've talked about the primary players. We're going to talk about maybe the players behind Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Jeudy, KJ Hamler, players that maybe Broncos fans need to keep an eye on, especially as there's 15 right now on the roster heading into training camp. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about the sponsor of today's episode of the show. That's our good friends over there, betonline.ag. And BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your sports action. With baseball season in full swing, NFL training camp coming up, you can track all the action at BetOnline. You get all the latest news, odds, and info for all your sporting needs, including MLB, NBA, NHL, and all of your UFC and MMA action. So before the next pitch or tip-off, head over to BetOnline on your laptop or mobile device and check out all the great sporting news, sign-up bonuses, and contest information. Don't sit on the sidelines anymore, as this is your chance to get into the game as teams prep for their runs to the playoffs. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit when you use promo code LOCKEDON. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Continuing our conversation about the Broncos wide receiver group. And ladies and gentlemen, before we get into that, I just want to remind you, the Colorado sports teams here, they have representation here in the Lockdown Podcast Network. The Denver Nuggets, obviously their season ended in round 2 being swept by the Phoenix Suns. But what's next for this Denver Nuggets basketball team? Check out Adam Matas and Matt Moore on the Locked On Nuggets podcast, part of the Locked On NBA Network. They're a great listen. Adam Matas is my go-to guy for all the pick and roll action that I need when I'm trying to scratch that Denver Nuggets itch that I have. What are they going to do this offseason? Is Nikola Jokic going to play for the Serbian national team in the Olympics? We'll have to see about that. But obviously, Adam has you covered with all the insight, news, and information that you could get. Locked On Nuggets. But continuing our conversation on today's episode of the show, take a look at the wide receiver roster. We talked about Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Jeudy, KJ Hamler. We're going to talk about the other players on this roster, maybe that can have an impact, that might play a rotational role. And it's also going to get into the conversation as to how many wide receivers Denver may carry on the roster here in 2021. And the other player too, and I'm basing this based off of maybe projected depth chart, but I'm going to talk about Tyrie Cleveland, obviously a second-year player out of Florida. Last year was very impressive in training camp, and a lot of people were calling him Baby Tim Patrick. Now, 6'4", 212 pounds. Tyrie Cleveland is 6'2", 209. So they were calling him Baby Tim Patrick because he rises up and he goes and gets everything. He's not afraid to go up in the air to contest for catches. And I think that for a guy who's 6'2", he's athletic, he's fast. I think that's a good thing that the Broncos can try to utilize, because he doesn't have to necessarily have that size, but he's got the ability with his vertical to go up and catch the ball in the air. Because when you factor in a Courtland Sutton or a Tim Patrick, their size alone, they're going to be the players that are going to be prime candidates for some of those 50-50 balls. Tyrie Cleveland doesn't have to be that guy, but when he's running on a deep post pattern or a vertical route, he can go up and get it. He can rise up above DBs. He's got tremendous body control when he's going up for routes. And we also saw him rise up a little bit last year for the Broncos down the stretch. That Raiders game, I mean, he was Drew Lock's go-to guy. I mean, almost too much that when the Broncos went for it on 4th and 3, they threw a 3-yard route to Tyrie Cleveland, and the defense was ready for it because they knew it was going to Tyrie, and that's after Tim Patrick got hurt in that game. But Tyrie Cleveland, in my opinion, not only is he going to be probably one of the most relied upon special teams players for the Broncos and Tom McMahon this season, he's going to be that guy that's going to have a breakout year. I mean, he's going to be a guy that when we're talking about players that people need to know about, Tyrie Cleveland is the guy I'm going to throw out there in that conversation because you're going to hear his name called quite a bit on Sundays. I think he's going to be in that rotational role that Deshaun Hamilton had for the Broncos last year. Tyrie has now taken that spot. Will we see too much of Deontay Spencer in the wide receiver mix on the field? I don't think so, unless they draw specific plays. I just can't see it, considering that more than likely he'd be the backup to KJ Hamler if something were to happen to KJ, because they have similar skill sets, similar speed, and they fit the mold of what Pat Shurmur wants in terms of that maybe utility player on the offensive side of the ball. So I don't really see that being too much of a factor for Deontay Spencer. But the fact that Tyrie Cleveland was a 7th-round pick in 2020 and he contributed the way that he did, he exceeded expectations by a lot. And he's had a great mini camp and OTAs for the Broncos, and we're going to see a lot of him in preseason. He's going to get an opportunity to really get a lot of on-field reps because the Broncos, they're not going to put too many of their starters out there in all the action, especially with 3 preseason games. You want to get them some action, but Tyrie Cleveland is going to see probably the most action out of all the wide receivers. And we'll get to Kendall Hinton here in a little bit, but he's one of those names I wanted to throw out. Trinity Benson still on the Broncos roster at wide receiver, obviously a 6-foot, 180-pound player out of East Central Oklahoma, and he's been bouncing around a little bit on the Broncos practice squad. He could be a candidate to return to the practice squad because of wide receiver depth, but not to mention special teams coordinator Tom McMahon mentioned he has the ability to catch kicks and punts. And we saw him actually do that a couple of training camps ago when I first got on the Broncos beat. We were able to see that. And he's one of those players, he impressed me. And I don't know if we're going to see too much of him in the preseason, maybe outside of maybe that 2nd or that 3rd game. But Trinity Benson is a name that you have to kind of keep an eye on. Is one of those under-the-radar wide receivers in Broncos training camp. And then one of the newest signings that the Broncos made on the final day of mini camp that the Broncos had the field day, they signed a wide receiver, Amaro Darboh, and he's a wide receiver, a 3rd-year player out of Michigan, has a lot of speed to him as well, could be a return threat for the Broncos as a kick returner, and there might be evident competition there. And I think that the Broncos obviously see something enough in Darboh to say, hey, we're going to bring him on and we're going to make his addition to the roster mean that we have 15 guys going into training camp. And when I asked Tom McMahon about other return options behind Deontay Spencer, I mean, he threw out about like 5 or 6 names of players there. So is Deontay Spencer's roster spot solidified? I think that really comes into question right now for this Broncos team, even though they brought him back as an ERFA, an exclusive rights free agent. He's going to have competition. It's just not going to be his job. But I think Deontay Spencer is really locked in. He's really focused on just doing what he's been doing best, and that's fielding punts, not dropping them. Now, if that becomes an issue in the preseason or training camp with consistent drops, then I think that the competition is going to heat up a little bit for him. Devontrez Dukes is another wide receiver that the Broncos added. He's a rookie player out of South Florida, 6'4", 216 pounds. If we're noticing a trend here, the Broncos, they like these sizable players. You know, George Payton really likes those guys as well because he talked about when he was the assistant general manager for the Vikings, he watched Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton up close and personal in 2019, and he said, hey, their size right there is super hard to contend with regardless of your skill set as a defensive back. So the Broncos may be looking in some of these future size players that may play a rotation, but it's very unlikely at this point considering the Broncos' 5-man depth as is, that is projected. Everything right now, I think, for spot 6 and spot 7 is really up for grabs, and I think that's going to be a big determining factor as to maybe the direction that the Broncos head, but a lot of that can't be answered right now. It has to be answered in training camp and preseason. So going down, KJ Hamler, we talked about him, has to stay healthy, just a speedy threat that the Broncos need to find a way to utilize in space and also on the vertical concepts. I mean, like I said, his route running ability is so underrated. And then let's get to Kendall Hinton. He's been the camp surprise. According to Broncos head coach Vic Fangio, has had the most impressive offseason. Jerry Jeudy even said that he's been destroying everybody. He hasn't seen anybody stop him just yet. So Kendall Hinton is in strong consideration right now to make the Broncos roster. And I'm going to go as far as right now, as of today, here on June 23rd, 2021. I'm going to say that Kendall Hinton is going to make the 53-man roster for the Broncos. I think he's going to be the 7th wide receiver option. Yes, I think that Denver will carry 7 wide receivers on the active roster this year, and it really doesn't matter about how many guys you carry. And I think that Vic Fangio did a great job. He mentioned this to me when I asked him a question about the Broncos safety depth. He says, you're not always restricted to just 2 deep at certain positions. If guys can contribute on special teams and also on the offensive side of the ball, they have more value than a guy that can maybe just contribute on one area of the field. If you can contribute to 2 areas of the ball, then you're going to have more value to the organization. Kendall Hinton, and I also think, too, the Broncos, they respect him so much because of what he did last year, stepping up and being a quarterback, volunteering to take on that role against the New Orleans Saints. It was a brutal day for him in terms of that defense coming after him, throwing him in the dirt, and obviously having a couple of interceptions. But for Hinton, they really like his heart and his tenacity, and he's been, from what I've been told, he's been great as a wide receiver. I mean, his route running ability has improved. He's been working with Jeudy, and he's also been one of those guys that's making those athletic plays. He's made a couple of one-handed catches in practice. So Kendall Hinton might be that surprise guy that's going to make the Broncos 53-man roster. Warren Jackson's another wide receiver, is 6'6", Colorado State local product, 219 pounds, 6'6" is the key. Could they convert him to tight end before training camp? I'm not sure, but keep an eye on Warren Jackson. He's going to be wearing the number 80 at practice. So if you go there for training camp, keep an eye on number 80. I'm going to be doing the same thing there. Brandon Mack is on the roster as well. He's a rookie out of Temple, 6'5" guy. And then you have DeMornay Pearson L, a 5'9", 185-pound speedy guy out of Nebraska. I mean, another return option in terms of the kick return game. The Broncos might be looking to bolster that. And Deontay Spencer, as I mentioned, can't enter the season feeling too comfortable because he's got all these young guys nipping at his heels. Seth Williams, obviously the Broncos' 7th-round pick out of Auburn, and Damian Willis, another wide receiver out of Troy, is a second-year player, 6'3", 204 pounds. The Broncos have a lot of depth at the wideout position. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to get into the conversation about maybe some roster projections. I'm going to project my 7-man Broncos wide receiver depth that I had hinted at a little bit earlier on today's episode of the show, but I'm also going to maybe get into some stat productions and projections as well. And you'll be free to join me in the comment section down below here on YouTube with your thoughts on the stat production of several players for the Broncos here in 2021. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about the 2 other sponsors of today's episode of the show. That's the good friends of their RockAuto.com and Built Bar. And with the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it is now impossible for your local chain stores to stock all the parts that you need for your vehicle. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts in their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to RockAuto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and money when you use RockAuto.com. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you can need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, or even new carpet. I myself, from RockAuto.com, I purchased a new steering wheel cover. I also purchased new floor mats for my vehicle when I made a new purchase as well. RockAuto.com. Go explore their easy-to-use website to find the solution to all your auto parts needs. Go to RockAuto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Lockdown Broncos in there. How did you hear about us box? So that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts that your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. And our good friends over there at Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market today. This morning before my workout, I took a bite of a peanut butter brownie Built Bar, and I also have to order a brand new box as well because I have 2 left in my fridge and I need to stay stocked up. Built Bar, they taste phenomenal. They're covered in 100% chocolate. They're soft and easy to chew. My secret formula, throwing it in the fridge or freezer for about an hour, taking a bite into it. It is clutch, folks, and I encourage you to do the same. Not only are Built Bars great tasting, but they're healthy for you as well. 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. That is very efficient use, and that is why I rock with Built Bar, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to get your hands on a box of Built Bar today, whether it's for you, whether it's for your wife. Be careful. Your wife will steal all of your Built Bars if she has never had one before and she tries it. You're never going to have a bite of one because she's going to take all of them. I promise. It's the same thing. My wife did that as well. I had to hide my Built Bar. But you can go to BuiltBar.com right now, and when you go to checkout, you can get 15% off your next order by using promo code LOCK15. Once again, promo code LOCK15 is going to get you 15% off your next order at BuiltBar.com. Getting into our roster projections here for the Denver Broncos in 2021 as our position preview series continues, leading us up to NFL training camp. Just a reminder, next week we're going to start off on Mondays with the tight end position. We're going to go offensive guard, and we're going to go offensive tackle on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, respectively. And then in a couple weeks, we're going to switch our focus to the defensive side of the ball for the Broncos. But our continuation here, we know that Courtland Sutton's going to make the roster, Jeudy, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, Tyrie Cleveland, and Seth Williams. I think those are the key guaranteed players to make the roster here. Now, I said earlier, I think the Broncos, they're going to keep probably about 7 wide receivers on their active depth chart in terms of guys that maybe will contribute on offense. They could add maybe 1 or 2 more based on special teams in depth as is. Very, very unlikely that the Broncos exceed the number 7 in terms of wide receiver player designations. You're going to see a lot of players, probably 3 or 4 wideouts be placed on the practice squad as it expands from 11 to 16 this upcoming season. I think for Courtland Sutton, what are the realistic expectations for his return off of ACL surgery? What is a realistic projection for him? I think as he gets to 100%, and George Paton says that he's close, even though the Broncos are going to ease him into practice once training camp begins, I think that for Courtland Sutton, this is a big year for him. He wants to play for that contract extension. He is that alpha male in that wide receiver room. And Courtland also played a massive role in that Pittsburgh Steelers game in week 2 before his ACL. He had a few catches for a lot of yards, and Drew Lock had one of those plays, and it was a back shoulder on one of the first plays of the game down the left sideline. And then Jeff Driscoll had a throw to him down the deep right side of the field as well, and he made a tremendous play. So Courtland's ability to make those plays on those vertical routes will give the Broncos an added element to where defenses, they may have to focus their coverage, a cornerback and a safety over the top to bracket Courtland's side, and that's going to leave opportunities for Jeudy, Tim Patrick, Noah Fant to open things up. And if one of those guys start hurting you, then all of a sudden the defense is going to have to shift their focus, and then you're going to see a lot more one-on-one matchups. So that's where Courtland really taking an emphasis on evolving in his route running on the short to intermediate routes, the inside breaking routes, the outside breaking routes. I think that's going to bode well for him. I think that we're going to see Courtland Sutton have a massive year this year. I think I'm going to project 7 touchdowns on the year for him. I'm going to project around 1,000 yards receiving. And I think also, too, I can't really project the number of receptions because the Broncos have so many guys. It's really hard to project considering we don't really know who the starting quarterback is going to be at the time right now for the Broncos as is. So I think that 7 touchdowns for Courtland. I think 1,000 yards receiving is very doable, very achievable for him. Jeudy, I think we're going to see a chance. I think Jeudy has an opportunity to get 10 touchdowns this year. And it may sound very bold, and a lot of it really predicates off the quarterback position. I know I've said that before, but I think Jerry has a chance to get 10 touchdowns this year, double digits. I think he's going to surpass 1,000 yards receiving. I think Tim Patrick will probably be in that 600 to 700 yard receiving range for the Broncos. KJ Hamler, more so probably in that 450 to 500 total range. But his dynamic is going to create so many opportunities with his speed and his versatility to be able to run those inside breaking routes, those outside breaking routes super effectively, and also to be able to get defensive backs to cheat, because in the NFL, when you're going against cornerbacks, they have this thing that their coaches teach them about. It's called cushion. And when that cushion is broken, you have to open up. So if you're playing zone coverage and your cushion, if you know that KJ Hamler's faster than you, a corner will adjust his cushion from about maybe 4 yards to about 5.5, 6 yards. So once that wide receiver breaks that threshold, he may turn those hips and he may run specifically in zone. And if it's man coverage, you really can't play too far off the ball because his speed, all he needs is one step to get inside and you're chasing him and you're not going to have an angle to be able to catch up to him. So I think if the Broncos are going to face situations of press, KJ has the opportunity with his release off the line of scrimmage and maybe being able to have that speed element to get behind a guy. Quarterbacks just got to throw it up and he's got to hit the right spot. I think that the Broncos have a lot of opportunities this year. It's really hard to project the overall production in terms of numbers because this is such a loaded wide receiver group. I think on paper, the Broncos might have one of the best wide receiver groups in the NFL when you factor in Courtland, Tim Patrick, Jeudy, KJ Hamler, Noah Fant, Albert Okwuegbunam. I mean, just the opportunities are endless. Tyrie Cleveland, I said he's going to be a name you have to watch. People are going to have to respect that. Denver has options this year. I think that's how it's all going to shake out in 2021. But Broncos country, let me know what your thoughts are below. Do you think the Broncos will carry 7 wide receivers on the roster? Do you think that Kendall Hinton will make the 53-man roster as well? Let us know in the comment section down below as we continue our position preview series on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. But ladies and gentlemen, with that said, that will do it for today's episode of the show. Just a reminder, Our next episode will appear on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. I'm on vacation, so I will not be able to do any shows on Thursday or Friday for the next 3 weeks. But once I get back from vacation on July 8th, we're going to go back to our 5-day-a-week format here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you love our Broncos content. You're going to get it every single day as the season progresses all year long, courtesy of yours truly. With that said, I'm Cody Roark, host of the show. We'll see you next time for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.